This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jespersen.
I want to welcome you to this episode of Real Talk. Jespersen here with John Hicks. In just a second, University of Calgary law professor Martin Olszynski, he was an intervenor at the Supreme Court. That ruling we were talking about last week, where Canada's top court essentially ruled, and maybe I'm dumbing this down too much, Martin can fact check this, but the way it's being spun by politicians, the way it's being celebrated by premiers, is that Canada's top court ruled in favor of the provinces, right? If you were to use supercharged, politically driven language, you would say that the court told the federal government, told Ottawa to butt out of matters of provincial affairs, of provincial autonomy when it comes to expansion of energy resources, pipelines, but also things like highways and railroads, and some are federal projects and some are provincial, but all of this was impacted. You remember Bill C-69? Remember former Premier Jason Kenney talking about the No More Pipelines Act? Well, how does the court's ruling demanding amendments to the act impact not just the relationship between the provinces and Ottawa, not just some of these big projects and Canada's energy future, Canada's infrastructure development, but also Justin Trudeau and the federal Liberals' climate plan? We're going to get to that today. Plus, Jay Ingram will join us. We're going to figure out how the future, in particular technology and innovation and things like brain implants, are going to influence where we live and, John, how we understand ourselves. The Future of Us is Jay's new book.
Scares the crap out of me. Those brain implants, those microchips, the ones that are going to supposedly help us answer emails behind our eyes.
But it's also, I mean, it seems weird and wild, but it's also kind of exciting in a way.
It is.
But yeah, I get what you're saying. When they're getting out the drill bit and they've got your cranium in front of them, and going, wait a second.
I'm sure it's not the drill bit. It's like one of those syringes, and it's boop, you're done. Right?
Yeah, we'll see. It takes like 30 seconds, and the next thing you know, like you said, you're reading emails without a screen in front of you. So Jay Ingram's coming up. We're not going to ignore, how could we ignore the fact that the tensions, the full-blown war between Israel and Hamas hit another horrific point over the past 24 hours, depending on when you're listening to this. But witnesses to a deadly blast at the Al-Ali Al-Arabi Hospital in Gaza are saying that more than 500 people were killed when the hospital was struck. Yeah, that's right. A hospital struck. Now, it's earning condemnation from people around the world, including nations surrounding Israel. But the position that Israel's taking, and we're showing you footage from Reuters right now if you're watching us on YouTube, Israel says, well, this was the other guys. They're saying that this was a rocket misfire. This was an attempted rocket launch by Hamas. They say that, a third of the rockets that Hamas attempts to launch fail, and that was the case here. President Joe Biden is on, obviously, a very high-profile visit. He's in, I believe, Tel Aviv as we're speaking. He's in Israel right now as the American president, and he's supporting Benjamin Netanyahu in this position, saying that the position of the United States as well is that it was, quote, the other guys, that this was not Israel that bombed a hospital. I can tell you that among the Real Talk community, whether you would be inclined to back Israel or back Palestine, or for that matter, just try to bring everybody to a position where we're reflecting on our own humanity, people are troubled by this. Number one, I want to let you know that coming up tomorrow, Gada Sasa is going to join us. Gada is one of the board members of an organization, Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East, and we've been communicating with her, trying to find an opportunity, a time that works for her, and we're looking forward to that interview. That's coming up tomorrow right here on Real Talk. That'll be on Thursday's episode. You'll also be able to send us your thoughts, as you are always. Our inbox open at talk@ryanjespersen.com. Before we talk Supreme Court, before we talk about energy infrastructure, we wanted to get to this. We've just received it from Brendan, a Real Talker who is in touch with us. The subject line, a plea for humanity in Gaza. He's written this note to us, as well as Alberta's Premier, to his elected officials. You can see his MP and his MLA are on the list, as is the Leader of Canada's official opposition and the Prime Minister. Brendan is making sure as much people as possible hear what he has to say. He says, I'm extremely concerned about the escalating conflict in Gaza. Says, I also feel extremely nervous writing about it. He says, but my discomfort will never match what Palestinians are living through right now. He says, thus, we need to act. Brendan says, as I understand the definition of genocide to be the deliberate targeting and killing of a particular nation or ethnic group, it strikes me that Israel is committing this crime against Palestinians in retribution for the crimes and acts of genocide of the terrorist organization Hamas. I also acknowledge and regret the horror and the fear that Jewish civilians are experiencing. All of this horrific, and we must condemn all of this race or ethnic or religious incited violence immediately, and we need to act now. Brendan says, as I've learned about this complex situation in Israel, it's extremely concerning to me that Canada has never spoken out and supported consequences for deliberate actions of apartheid in past. Not only do Palestinians face death and destruction now, as they have been under the thumb of an oppressor, faced constant human rights violations for their identity. Since the 1940s, as supporters of human rights and sustainable development goals around the world, as Canadians begin to understand the truth of our own past, how can we not speak out? It's a point-blank contradiction of our own moral high ground as defenders of democracy, freedom, and human rights. As defenders of Ukraine and of the ideals of the West, we only expose ourselves as hypocrites and further complicate our ability to work with other nations and represent our values on a global scale. Brennan goes on and talks about what he'd like to see his elected officials do. He wants to see the state of Israel called out for refusing to allow aid into Gaza. We'll talk about that tomorrow. He's calling for an end to the violence, for the safe release of all hostages involved in this conflict. He wants the U.S. to stop arming the conflict. He wants to see strong condemnation against the terrorist organization Hamas, calling for a peaceful surrender. He's got a whole list of things he's putting in front of his elected officials here. And then Brendan signs off. I understand there are geopolitical concerns with the state of Israel as a close ally to the West, but we have an ethical imperative to protect human life, to de-escalate this conflict before all-out war ensues. We also must consider how our silence, how unfettered support for Israel in the face of these travesties make Canada an accomplice to these crimes against humanity. Brendan signs off, a concerned citizen. You can do what Brendan did and send us an email. We get to as many as we can through the week, and we're grateful for what you do as Real Talkers to further those conversations. Now, we've all heard by now that credential fraud is on the rise, right? Whether it's nurses or oil patch workers or personal support workers, there's been no shortage of news headlines where a fake credential put people's safety at risk. Luckily, there's an innovative technology that'll make credential fraud a thing of the past. Digital verifiable credentials are secure, cloud-based credentials that go way beyond a traditional certificate, digital badge, or PDF. They're impossible to forge, falsify, or alter. Verifiable credentials are tamper-proof and are independently verifiable credentials. They use open web standards. They're trusted, real-time digital credentials that live in a digital wallet, and they can be viewed, managed, and shared from anywhere. With We Know Training, they can plug seamlessly into your training courses. You want to learn more about using verifiable credentials in your training or credentialing program? Visit verifiablecredentials.ca. Well, as most folks broke from their work week last Friday, everybody in Ottawa, at least those in the halls of power, were focusing on a decision down from Canada's Supreme Court, ordering amendments to the Impact Assessment Act. This had previously been known as Bill C-69. This was the one that, in particular, Western premiers were banging the drum over, saying that the federal government was doing everything it could to kill Canada's energy industry. You remember that? The so-called No More Pipelines bill, as Jason Kenney called it. Well, the support from the Supreme Court, 5-2 the decision, which is significant, a win for the provinces. But what does this all mean? To make sense of this, we turn to Martin Olszynski. He's an associate professor at the University of Alberta School of Law, and he acted as co-counsel for WWF Canada, the World Wildlife Fund, and intervened in front of the Supreme Court. It's so nice to have you back on the show. Thanks for making time for us, Martin.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Yeah, kind of a cool opportunity, I would imagine, as somebody involved in your profession and what you do as a resource lawyer to intervene in front of the Supreme Court. Is that a first for you? Have you done this several times? How'd you get involved?
Yeah, so actually, I was involved in the carbon price reference a couple of years ago as well. And I think the idea basically is just that it's not that often that environmental law cases make their way to the country stop court. In fact, right now we're batting at about one or two every decade or so. So for sure, when these things go up, it's an opportunity for interveners, especially in addition to the parties making their main arguments. Sort of the role of the intervener is to try to provide a different perspective, try to help the court understand the issue. So when that opportunity presents itself, yeah, you take it for sure.
So you're going to have a different take on this, or a different perspective than a politician would. We understand that what politicians got to do. They got to rally the public. They got to have their message stick. They got to have the taglines and the catchphrases. The No More Pipelines bill really stuck. A lot of people thought that's actually what the bill was called, when of course it wasn't. What tone did you take, or what was the general message that you wanted to make sure that you presented to Canada's top court?
Yeah, I mean, so the story that we tried to say is like, look, this is about decision making, and this is, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but when we think about environmental law across Canada, I think a lot of people have this misperception that we have these like very clear rules and standards, and you just apply the rules and the standards. And sometimes even we've gotten this impression that, for instance, impact assessment is like superfluous or a process for process sakes that doesn't actually do anything. But the reality is that in a lot of cases, we don't actually have clear standards. And what we just have is decision making. We let the regulators make a judgment call in each instance. How much harm are we going to allow? How much impacts to fish habitat? How many impacts to migratory birds? Or how much of an interference with navigation or species at risk or whatever? And so the role of impact assessment is really to inform that decision making, to provide decision makers with that information, and then to make a decision that is politically accountable. And so then our role, in the idea that, because, Parliament, neither Parliament nor the legislatures are keen on binding their hands very tightly, right? They want to be able to make these calls in the moment, as it were, like on a case by case basis. And so our sort of submission primarily, and I was intervening on behalf of WWF Canada, was to say, like, when that happens, and the idea is that when they make those decisions, they're politically accountable, democratically accountable, and that we as Canadians, as Albertans, we're going to bring political pressure to bear on our governments if they're doing environmentally destructive things. And so our submission was really like, let's make sure that when the feds are making decisions about federal impacts, that they are able to be politically accountable for those. And when there's provincial impacts, then the provinces are politically accountable for those. But that, in a lot of cases, there's going to be overlap, shared jurisdiction overlap, and that we can't sort of override one or the other.
Well, and I want to talk about, just like, to make what might be an obvious point, but that's also that there aren't sort of like environmental borders between Saskatchewan and Manitoba, or between Ontario and Quebec, and there needs to be a shared concern, of course, within Canada and globally about the future of our planet. And people can and do debate about the role that each nation needs to play, about the value of things like, Kyoto and Paris Accords and all that kind of stuff. Am I oversimplifying when I say, this is a win for the provinces? This is a big loss for Trudeau's climate plan?
I mean, yeah, I think I don't want to say you're oversimplifying, and you'd be justified in doing so. I mean, we're in this world where, premiers get up in front of everybody and make what are pretty clear attempts to mislead and sort of misinform people. So what the Supreme Court basically said was that this act, the Impact Assessment Act that was passed, Bill C-69, that in important parts, it was not sufficiently focused on federal effects, right? So that it has to be more tightly focused, more tightly tethered to the federal government staying in its lane. But really important, the court said very clearly that there's no such thing as immunity or like a shield for provincial projects or projects that are primarily regulated by the province, right? So so for instance, like, because the premier talked about oil sands in the province, the Supreme Court was very clear. You can do impact assessment federally of an oil sands mine, even if it doesn't cross borders itself. The issue is, does it impact areas of federal jurisdiction? And so we know that these are migratory birds, fish and fish habitat, Indigenous peoples and lands reserved for Indigenous peoples, and there's a couple others. And so, in the immediate sort of context of the Impact Assessment Act, the provinces took a win, and the feds took a loss for sure. I'm not going to pretend that's not the case. But when we look at the decision more broadly, and we look at some of the rules that the court laid down, and what I say, and my colleagues and I, we've written a blog about this. It's up on the University of Calgary Law School website, blog, these are manageable challenges that can now be adjusted and dealt with.
Your blog, by the way, and we'll have that in the show notes on the podcast, YouTube, wherever anybody wants to find it. And I recommend it. I mean, you've dumbed it down for us, Martin, with your colleagues Nigel Banks and David Wright, which is great. It makes a solid point in here, which again might be obvious, but it's worth pointing out, and that is that nobody was I shouldn't speak for people 150 years ago, but nobody was particularly concerned about the environment back in 1867, at least to the point that it's not specifically mentioned or referenced anywhere in the Constitution Act in 1867. Does that create a bit of a quagmire for the courts, or what are the implications, when it comes to politics and shared responsibilities present day?
Yeah, I mean, it does for sure, right? And I will say, going back to your earlier point, like it seems from a policy perspective, federalism is really kind of it's a bit of a pain, I have to say, in a sense, in that, like in other countries where they have a strong central government, they're just able to, and I don't mean like communist or whatever, I just mean in the sense that the national government has broad powers. They're able to deal with things like what is clearly a global and international issue like climate change, without having to worry about it very much, frankly. The question then is always just about what are the good policies. But in Canada, because we are a federation, because we have this idea like that, regionalism and provincial autonomy, then we have to sort of make our way through it. And it's not to say it's impossible. And in fact, the court has, like, the jurisprudence of the court over 30 years, I think, generally facilitates cooperation in the space. They've said, look, the environment's not mentioned. Yeah, perfect. And so they said each level of government under their respective legislative authorities, Section 91 of the Constitution for the feds and Section 92 for the provinces, they each have ways of accessing and dealing with environmental issues, right? And so you have that list there, and that's great. Thanks for putting that up. And we did take great pains. I'll plug it. We wanted to make this accessible for non-lawyers because it's such an important part of this debate, I think. And so then, yeah, the court has said, like, each of you has a role to play here. And sometimes that's going to overlap, and that's okay. But you do need to try to stick to your constitutional lane. So if you're worried about fisheries, the court says, you have to keep yourself focused on fisheries. You can't start worrying about the overall sustainability, for instance, of a mine. You want to stay focused on those impacts to fisheries in that specific instance and whether or not those are acceptable. And let the province deal with the other issues that fall within its wheelhouse, right? So going forward, again, the court made it very clear, and this is why, the premier, I was just kind of gobsmacked when she was making the comments that she was. The court said very clearly, you can have a major project review regime like this. You can apply it presumptively, like you can pick projects that you think will have an impact on areas of federal jurisdiction and then screen those decisions. When you're screening them, the most important point should be the potential impact on areas of federal jurisdiction. And then you can do broad assessment. The court made that very clear, went out of its way to say you can then do a very broad assessment, but then at the decision making, focus it back to those impacts on areas of federal jurisdiction.
We when the court's ruling came down, it was on a Friday. Obviously, this is like Murphy's Law. This stuff always, you get big news events on a Friday. We've already done our show. We got to sit there and chomp at the bit for like 2 days to get into this. So we touched on it on Monday, and I think that it's fair to describe Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith as reveling in the ruling. She was almost, I don't know if I want to use the word gloating, but she was certainly thrilled by it. She was rattling her saber. She basically said that, this should serve as a warning for the Supreme, from the Supreme Court for the feds to, understand they should butt out. She said, quote, if you believe in fairness, common sense, and the sanctity of the Canadian Constitution, today's a great day. The common sense thing, I think, is interesting. Obviously, the Supreme Court never tasked with ruling based on common sense. That's going to be Pierre Poilievre's platform, we know, over the next. He's starting to wear T-shirts that say that splashed across the chest. But that was Alberta's Premier's position on it. When you say you were gobsmacked, and you've seen a lot, Martin, we've talked to you about politics and environmental law before. What was particularly notable about what Danielle Smith had to say within the last week about this?
Well, yeah. So I think in large part, just this idea that suddenly that there wouldn't be a federal impact assessment regime that could apply to projects that are within the province, in a sense that that's not just going to be restricted to interprovincial pipelines and railways, for instance. So that was a big part. But I think the other part is this kind of like what I think is a deliberate sort of mixing of apples and oranges. So this case was about impact assessment. But of course, the federal list of sort of legislative authorities and the different ways that it's tackling issues like climate change, for instance, is quite big. And one of the issues I think is like everyone's asking, well, what does this mean for the clean electricity regulations from the federal government? What does it mean about an oil and gas emissions cap? Does that mean that those things are dead on arrival? And the thing that we have to understand, and that your viewers have to understand, is that for those regulations, Parliament's relying on a very different head of power that wasn't in play even here, which is to say their criminal law power. And by criminal law, we don't mean the criminal code. It's not that, this is all going to be part of the criminal code or anything like that, but just that. So Parliament has this, one of the heads of power under Section 91 is the criminal law, the power to make laws in relation to the criminal law. And the courts have over 30 years interpreted that very broadly, right? So we rely on that power at the federal level, for instance, to pass restrictions and prohibitions on tobacco advertising. And that was tested and upheld by the Supreme Court. We've used it for genetic information sharing and prohibitions on that, and that was recently upheld by the court. So it's criminal law in a broad sense, and that is the power that the feds are relying on when they talk about the clean electricity regulations, when they talk about a cap on oil and gas emissions. And so it's very different, and so at best, my most generous interpretation is that there's something in the tone of the Supreme Court's decision here which suggests that they are reasserting the primacy of the Constitution. Like, yes, environmental protection is important. In fact, in the first paragraph, actually, very interestingly, the Chief Justice says that Canadians have a right to a clean environment, but the federal and provincial governments have to work within their lanes. But the overall framework, and that's that diagram that you had put up, it does allow, what the Supreme Court said here certainly does, in theory at least, allow for the feds to come in with a tailored prohibition on emissions, whether it's for clean electricity or for oil and gas, and for that to coexist and live at the same time as provincial regulation of electricity, right? And it's like the diagram there says, you can have, and what the court says very clearly, you can have a fact situation, a project or an activity, and it can be regulated under a federal aspect and at a provincial aspect at the same time.
Yeah, and just for people to know, to revisit or sort of reiterate what you're already saying, the position of the Alberta government right now is that this Supreme Court ruling from just a few days ago will have implications on basically Alberta ignoring, they didn't use that word, but Alberta ignoring or opting out of the incoming federal cap on oil and gas rate on emissions, as well as any legislation or basically anything coming out of Alberta that has to do with the Sovereignty Act. Now, you've explained to us why you don't think that's the case, but I think one of our assignments, how I view our assignment every morning, is to take something that's important but might be complex, to bring in experts like you and to put it into everyday person's language, so the average person that's chatting over beers or coffees with their friends can sort of have a fact-based or informed perspective on what this means for us, right, for the general public. An interesting comment here from Ken in our live chat, who says basically, like, what we badly need is an expedited process that speeds disagreements through the courts in weeks or at worst months, not years. I mean, does Canada have, is this a rhetorical question? Canada kind of does have a reputation for painfully slow permitting processes, for painfully slow development. But a lot of people, I can already get ahead of the objection, are going to say, yeah, because we care about things like environmental impact and consultation and reconciliation and a million other things. Where do you land on that? What would you say back to Ken?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I wonder if Ken's also getting at this idea, though, of expediting, sort of getting answers from the courts. And so I think on that point, for instance, we've seen it in other contexts. So for instance, one of the things that Canada has tried to do over the last couple of years was to come up with like a harmonized security regulator, because right now securities, financial stuff is regulated by each province. And so there's been efforts to come up with a way to sort of harmonize those, because everyone recognizes it'd be nice to have some kind of like national standard. When the federal government cooked up the regime there, it went to the Supreme Court with a reference and said, how does this work? And the Supreme Court said, this doesn't work. So then they went back and they fixed it. And then they went directly back to the Supreme Court and asked for another reference. And on that one, the court said, yeah, this is okay. We've had references for, back 20 years ago when we legalized same-sex marriages. The Parliament took it to the Supreme Court first for a reference. So I think that that's something that we might expect to see. It's certainly something that should be on debate, is that when the federal Parliament here goes back to make the changes to this act to comply with the Supreme Court's decision, there may be merit in sending it directly to the Supreme Court right away and saying, is this okay? Did we do what you needed us to do? And maybe at the same time ask a couple other questions. I have a few, there's a couple head scratchers in that decision on Friday that I have a hard time with. And so there might be also an opportunity and value and merit in sort of saying, instead of waiting for a province to challenge it again or a proponent to just go ahead and send that reference to the Supreme Court. We'll see. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Well, what's one of the head scratchers that us plebs could understand, Martin?
Well, so one of the interesting things I find, for instance, right, is the Supreme Court says at the end, when you're making a decision, you have to focus on the impacts on federal jurisdiction, right? So like fish and fish habitat, right? And so sort of, and the court seems to suggest that when you consider that, whether or not that's in the public interest, you're allowed to consider the benefits of that impact on of like that project, for instance, but you can't consider that in a broad sense. You can't consider, for instance, like the other negative effects. So to give you a concrete example, right? Like if I'm the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, I get to decide whether or not you get to impact, let's say, like thousands of hectares of fish habitat, which is the case when we're talking about oil sands mine. We're talking about, right, like often massive footprints. The court seems to say that I consider the benefits of that project against the impacts. Whereas to my mind, it seems like if I'm in charge, if I'm autonomous as the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and I get to decide whether those impacts are sufficient, it seems to me like I should be able to do a fulsome cost benefit analysis and say, like, is this a good project? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth me sacrificing, giving up essentially this, what the courts have previously referred to as like a source of national wealth for Canadians, a national resource, the fishery resource. Is it worth it, right? And so then it's sort of weird for the court to say, when you do that cost benefit analysis, you can't consider the other bad things, but you can consider the other, like the monetary benefits. And then they seem to sort of the economic benefits. And then they don't seem to really parse those between federal or provincial. They just say benefits generally, right? So there's like a few things there that are kind of like asymmetrical in my view, but I think, we can deal with it. I get the overall, like there's an overall logic there, which says like, if the environment isn't just federal and it's not just provincial, then when the feds are in the game because they have jurisdiction over fisheries, then they should really focus on like, is this impact of fisheries and fish habitat, is that a good idea or not?
It's good to see Mark Doran in our chat. Mark joined me in studio. It was back on August 16th. If people want to check out that interview, the thumbnail, the episode title, if you're looking on our podcast archive, Make Alberta Oil Ethical Again. Mark speaking on behalf of the Polluter Pay Federation. In our live chat, he says federal approvals are slow, while provincial approvals are almost always immediate, basically made with a rubber stamp. We spent a lot of time this summer, Martin. We kind of got down a rabbit hole, like in a positive way, and dedicated a number of episodes to talking about regulation and environmental impacts and things like proposed new developments and infrastructure and the energy futures and orphan wells and the Alberta Energy Regulator, the AER. And it's a fair question to ask if, quite frankly, anybody can have faith in anything that the Alberta Energy Regulator is doing right now. A U of C study that you're pretty tight with, you're pretty close to, concludes that there's a public inquiry needed into the AER. Can you take us into this?
Yeah, so this is a report that we released earlier this month. And it's really looking at, you've talked about that issue tons, right? Of, what are these liabilities, right? And we have, for the conventional oil and gas sector, anywhere between 60 billion and 130 billion. For the non-conventional oil sands, another 130 billion. And so what we wanted to do is sort of say, when the province a couple of years ago was like, okay, fine, we understand there's a problem. We have this new liability management framework. And so we wanted to sort of say, okay, what are the odds that this is actually going to do the things that they say it's going to do? And in the course of doing that, we went back 40 years. And yeah, what we find is just like very classic, sort of predictable deficiencies in this regime, in the governance structure here, that has led us to this place where we have $260 billion potentially of liabilities on the landscape, with less than 1.5 or 2 billion sort of secured against that. And it speaks to this Impact Assessment Act reference too, because the basic answer, and I think Mark nailed it. I mean, the industry in this province has the regulator wrapped around their finger. I mean, there's no other way to understand and explain how the province has for 2 decades watched the inactive well count and these closure liabilities climb and climb and climb and climb to the point now where the industry would have to spend $700 or $800 million a year, which is what they're suggesting right now, and it would still take over 60 or 70 years to close that liability gap. So that takes us into almost the next century, right? We're talking about 2083. Does anyone really think that that's a realistic timeline? Does anyone really think that the industry is going to be able to close that gap, that funding gap, and deal with those liabilities over that course of time? It's just, and it just blows the mind, but that's what's happened. And it's happened because the regulator acts in secrecy. The regulator has way too much discretion. The laws are written such a way that it's like basically regulator go do stuff and they can do whatever they want. And then they are captured. And we show in our report over 20, 30 years where a policy might come out and that policy might have teeth. Suddenly 20 or 30 meetings later with the industry, and suddenly that policy has no teeth and it has no effect, and it leads us to the place that we are today.
Here's the question that can get us both into hot water. There have been, you look at like who's appointed to the AER, who's collecting the biggest paychecks when it comes to the AER, where they came from in Canada, what jobs they were doing before, who brought them here, who appointed them, these patronage appointments. It's like obviously the more that people dig, the more concerned or disgusted or cynical they will become. But at the end of the day, Martin, like what are the consequences? Here's the hot water question. This isn't like a lock her up type thing that I'm talking about, but is this just that people will go down in history as saying, yeah, that person was appointed here by this premier and collected a fat paycheck and acted in the interests of big oil and basically betrayed the people of Alberta and kind of, quite frankly, fucked us all over. But at the end of the day, as they retire in Bermuda and they've got their boat and they're, reeling in ahi tuna every day, they don't give a rip. They don't even live in Alberta anymore. And oh, well, a big shrug? Or are there like consequences? Is there something the public can do? As we hear from expert after expert after expert on the show saying that the Alberta Energy Regulator is controlled by industry, that the people of Alberta are being underrepresented and quite frankly insulted. I mean, what leverage or what levers does the public have here?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's why, ultimately our strongest recommendation, I mean, we can talk about things like bonding requirements, like actually putting security up. We can talk about timelines on wells, but none of that's going to happen in the current sort of political and regulatory climate. And so that's why we call for a public inquiry, right? We've called public inquiries into this province for way lesser things. Currently, actually, the Alberta Utilities Commission is conducting an inquiry into renewables with a moratorium for 6 months, where one of the major drivers apparently is concern for reclamation. So let's have, at the very least, like we're not even calling for a moratorium here when we're talking about $260 billion in like estimated liabilities. We're saying, give us an inquiry. Give us an inquiry that is independent from your government, independent from your regulator. Bring the regulator to that inquiry, make it produce records, make it answer some of these questions, but also going forward, let us have that information about what is actually the extent of the liabilities here? What are the issues? What are the concerns around methane? What are the concerns around soil remediation and groundwater? Let's have that conversation out in the open. Show us your plan, how it's going to work. And so that's why that's our call for a public inquiry, is because that, and there have been inquiries, of course, which can lead to some, like when we bring that sunlight in, I'm going to channel Premier Kenney when he launched that inquiry against environmental groups. Let's bring some sunlight into this. Let's disinfect this. Or, channeling Premier Smith when the Curl spill happened and we found out that the regulator didn't tell First Nations about spilling, leaching
for 9 months.
For 9 months. Radical transparency, she said. We need to have radical transparency. All right, let's have that radical transparency. Don't make us FOIP, file all kinds of freedom of information requests where my co-author, Drew, for instance, has to at one point, we're told that there are no responsive records, but then there's a reference to a box. So then he just FOIPs the box. He says, please provide me the records in the box. And then lo and behold, he opens the box and there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that's useful. We need that radical transparency. And this is all we can do. And then, I'm grateful to be on this show. And this is that stuff that, Albertans need to know about this stuff. But ultimately, yeah, this is when we're talking about a pension, when we're talking about all kinds of things like an Alberta pension, all of these things hinge on a bit of a fairy tale, frankly, about what Alberta's economic situation is. Our current debt is $80 billion. If we assume these liabilities on behalf of this oil and gas sector, if we let them walk away from these liabilities, one of two things are going to happen. Either A, these things stay on the landscape forever, which I don't think landowners are going to be stoked about, or else we're going to have to pay for them, which doubles or triples, in the context of conventional oil and gas liabilities, Alberta's debt.
Yeah, Martin, you know exactly what's going to happen, though. You know exactly what's going to happen. Landowners are left holding the bag. That is exactly what's going to happen. And so no wonder landowners are so pissed. No wonder so many of them are lining up, many of them that have been conservative donors and voters. And this is not to give a pass to anybody else. I guess Rachel Notley and the NDP had 4 years to do something about it, but I don't see anybody making any meaningful progress on this. And it's why it's so remarkable. I mean, it's the same as the coal story. You know, it wasn't lost on me that a whole bunch of country singers and basically folks from the conservative heart of Alberta, southern Alberta, around those eastern slopes. When you look at how they vote, you look at the margin of victory for conservative candidates in ridings like around the Crow's Nest Pass, and then they're lining up to roast the government because finally they're realizing, and that's not an insult or slight to them, finally everybody's realizing who's getting screwed here. And it's not the corporations and it's not the government. If people want to hear, by the way, my conversation with Chief Alan Adam from the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan First Nation, that episode was released by us back on March 6th. You're looking for the episode titled 9-Month Toxic Leak Hidden from First Nation. And tragically, Martin, despite the fact that that episode is 7 months old, nothing's really changed. Although we are getting regular emails from Imperial Oil's PR team letting us know all the work that they're doing to clean up the leak that they kept concealed for more than 9 months. Martin Olszynski appeared as co-counsel for World Wildlife Fund Canada. WWF Canada intervened at the Supreme Court. He's an associate professor of law at the University of Calgary, working on the PhD. Want to get you back when that's done so we can talk a bit more about that. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. Somebody said, finally, some truth. So take that as a compliment as you walk through your day.
I will. Cheers, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
You bet, buddy. Of course, you know, we every single morning from our official social media accounts, our Real Talk social media accounts, we let you know who's coming up on the show, in particular on our Twitter account. And the reason I'm mentioning that is you can see Martin's handle there. Go ahead and give him a follow. It's Molszyns. Well, I guess that's his hockey nickname or something like that. That's MOLSZYNS. Give us a follow on Real Talk RJ's Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok accounts. Thanks for your engagement on this. Obviously, this is a conversation that will continue. I guarantee that some of what Martin said is going to light a fire under some of you, and we'll let you know that coming up on Friday, you know our tradition, formerly known as Trash Talk. It's going to be reintroduced to you this Friday. I'm very excited about it. I guarantee you're going to love it. But for the promotion or the opportunity, the platform formerly known as Trash Talk, if this interview here, this conversation has resonated with you, you can send us your rant to talk@ryanjespersen.com. Jay Ingram is coming up in just a second. We're going to talk about our future as humans, the future of us. How does technology and innovation play into it? What will our future identities be shaped by? How will we decide where we live and why? Things like prosthetics and brain implants and agriculture and all kinds of stuff. Jay digs into it, and we're connecting with him ahead of his presentation. He and the Dark Sky Band coming up at the Jasper Dark Sky Festival, which is already underway, as you know, in beautiful Jasper, Alberta. This episode is sponsored by our friends at Athabasca University. You already know that Athabasca University gives you that flexibility to learn at your own pace. The beauty of it, that the only commute is to your device, and so it works for a lot of people across the country. But we also wanted to let you know how AU is literally transforming people's lives. What about Hannah? Hannah's a student in the Bachelor of Management program. She's working toward her degree. And in AU's Transforming Lives series, you can read about how, well, Hannah's life was turned upside down by the pandemic. She was laid off 5 different times working in the fitness industry. She had to find a post-secondary solution that worked for her. She needed a flexible platform because she had no idea when she was studying when she might be called back to work. She's also got a health condition that plays into her decision-making. She never knows if she'll have to miss classes or tests if she has a flare-up. I mean, Hannah is just one of the many, many students at Athabasca University, but what she loves about her Bachelor of Management degree there is she gets to curate her options. She's developing skills as a business person, but she still is curious and intrigued by environmental and health sciences. So she never feels like she's missing learning about her passion because she's got a ton of options on courses she takes as she shapes her own customized experience. It's just one of the ways that Athabasca University is transforming lives. You can learn more, get the application process started today at athabascau.ca. Our friends at Kubi Renewable Energy want to let you know that this is a perfect time of year to start looking into the options of going green, of going sustainable on your own home front. It could be on the roof of your house. It could be on your barn, your cabin, your cottage, your warehouse. Whatever it is, Kubi does it all. You know that solar energy capacity has been growing by 60% per year for more than 10 years? What a scale up. And Kubi Energy has been outpacing the market since 2015. They are Western Canada's busiest and most reputable solar installer. You're going to want to connect with their team now. They can get through the paperwork, get the design process started, and then there's some work they can do through the winter if your roof doesn't qualify. First thing in spring, you'll have Kubi's certified installers up there getting you going green. Also, a big shout out to our friends at Friesen Brothers. They've got their Oktober Feast promotion coming up on the 21st and 22nd of this month. You can find more details on their website, friesen.com, or go visit them in store. This is a German-inspired all-you-can-eat meal for just $25 per person at all of Friesen Brothers' Fresh Market stores. That's October 21st through 22nd from 4 to 8 p.m. at Edmonton, Stony Plain, Hinton Hill, Peace River, Fort Saskatchewan, and Drumheller. Jay Ingram has established his reputation over decades. Canada's media landscape as one of our country's most talented and most passionate storytellers when it comes to science, when it comes to innovation. Everybody recognizes him as a credible voice on not just where we are, thanks to tech and innovation, but where we're going. And he writes about all of it, our future, that is, in his brand new book published by Simon & Schuster, The Future of Us. Jay joining us ahead of his appearance with his Dark Sky Band coming up in Jasper in just a short while. It's nice to see your face again, man. Welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Ryan. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Johnny and I out of the gates today. We've been obviously doing some digging into your new book. Congratulations. And the whole idea of brain implants has us going, okay, how exactly is this going to work? You want to jump right in?
Yeah, I do. Because what's been happening in the last 6 months or a year maybe with brain implants is pretty fantastic, because what it's revealing is that if you get, if you get electrodes spread over the surface of the brain and you get them in the right places in the brain, you can actually listen to and record the brain activity. So for instance, if you train a monkey, and this has been done a lot by Elon Musk's company Neuralink, but it's been done elsewhere as well. If you train it to play Pong, move the joystick, play Pong. They're very good at it. They get a banana smoothie as a reward every time they hit the target. But if you link a computer to their brain implant, so you're recording from their brain, that what we're looking at now is a human skull, but you see all those little black dots. Those are electrodes resting on the surface of the brain. You can do amazing things, like in the case of the monkey can play, once the computer is familiar with the brain activity associated with the monkey's hand moving right or left, forward or back, the computer can play the Pong game based on the brain activity in the monkey. The monkey doesn't have to use a joystick. So what that says to me is, if we can understand what's going on in the brain by having a set of electrodes in there, not penetrating the brain tissue, but resting on top, you can help people who have, for instance, disabilities in being able to speak. There was a famous case recently of a woman from Regina named Anne who hadn't been able to speak for 18 years because of a stroke.
Wow.
But she could still formulate the words that she wanted to say. She just couldn't articulate them. But the brain implant has trained up on her brain activity, and now she wants to say something within a couple of seconds. The words will come out generated by the computer. And this group in California has even gone further. And created an avatar of Anne whose mouth moves to look like it's speaking the words that the computer, she couldn't have a conversation until this brain implant. And now there's beautiful video of her sitting next to her husband, who's wearing a Saskatchewan Roughriders t-shirt, by the way.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Yeah.
And talking about the Blue Jays and him saying, you're a little bit optimistic about them, as it turned out to be. So, there's a lot of dramatic over-prediction by people like Elon Musk, who thinks we know he's a little bit unusual, right? But he said recently, like 2 weeks ago, that brain implants will allow us to have a much broader band connection with another person's brain or with AI. And one of Musk's apparent desires is to have you get a brain implant, you connect with AI, and suddenly you're a million times smarter than you were. So that picture you just showed is pretty funny, because I got an AI company to generate it. And what I asked it for was, imagine someone in the future with a really hyper powerful computer who's running a simulation of the Earth. People doing things, people like us, because philosophers have been arguing over the topic of, do we live in a computer simulation? Is what we think reality all around us really just existing in some super powerful computer in the future? I don't even know if that's possible. People are split as to whether it's likely or even possible. But, when you talk about the future, you like to talk about things that are happening, but you like to go a little bit beyond that into things that might never happen, but are worth thinking about.
Yeah, man, you're blowing our minds on multiple levels here. I don't know why this is like the dumbest, most immature part of me. You're talking about folks that have been unable to speak, and then I'm thinking of Homer Simpson when he's like, "Oh, I said the quiet part loud." It's like, no, I didn't want it to say that part that I was thinking. In all seriousness, I was hanging out with my cousin last night, Steven. He's a good friend of this show. He's probably watching right now. Stephen is one of the bravest innovators that you will ever see, because about 10 years ago, he was diagnosed with MS. And MS is slowly taking its toll. First, it meant that he had to leave his job, and then it meant that he had to start using a cane, and then it meant that he had to start using a chair. And everybody knows how it is, and I am so damn proud of Stephen. What's been really interesting is, despite all of these challenges and some of the heartbreak that comes with those challenges, he's also been able to tap into some of the technology that's allowed him to keep some of his independence and keep some of his abilities to communicate and to get around and those types of things. And as MS continues to take its toll, he leverages more technology to allow him to continue to do things that are important to him and that would be important to anybody. We were talking about tech. I mentioned to him that you were coming on the show today, Jay, and so I know he's going to be checking this out. But the amazing way that tech is allowing people with disabilities, people that have suffered horrific accidents, whatever the case may be, to continue to live lives with quality outcomes. On our live chat, somebody's making that point. And they say, wow, I mean, the implications here for folks with disabilities are significant. But what about the ethical issues? Do you get into that in your book?
Yeah, although interestingly, one of the things about, about writing a book about the future is that it actually isn't a very good decision to do that, because what happens is, as you're writing it, the future catches up with you. And then as you get closer to publication date, where you have to actually start locking the book down, things are still happening. So here's an ethical issue. Elon Musk's company, there was an article in Wired magazine about 2 weeks ago suggesting that many of the macaque monkeys that they had experimented with had died unpleasant deaths, and these were covered up. It was the next day that Elon Musk came out and said, we're recruiting our first human patient for our brain implant. And like I just said a few minutes ago, we're going to increase communication between humans and AI. So I think it's really important to separate the really useful, really important, fantastic progress that's being made to help people like your cousin and many others to be able to lead as full a life as possible. And the conjectures by people like Elon Musk and other Silicon Valley people of some kind of crazy far off future. But, as Arthur C. Clarke, the science writer, said, if you want to know what's going to be possible in the future, you have to push a tiny bit past the possible into the impossible. And you know what? I think he's right, because he always contended that people that made kind of mild predictions, that's not interesting. It's the predictions that seem impossible to you that actually turn out to exist.
Okay, so I know you're going to be probably talking about this in Jasper, and we'll let people know all the details. This is a really neat opportunity. You can check out, by the way, jasperdarksky.travel, see how you can listen to Jay Ingram and the Dark Sky Band show, which is going to be super cool. The Jim Vena stage at Commemoration Park. It's a free event, open to the public, starting at 7:30 on October 21st. But, Jay, we can go too far, right? I don't want to be the buzzkill here, but when you say, to determine what's possible, we got to venture into the impossible. As human beings, and people do entire PhDs on this, how do we know when we're far enough? How do we know when we're talking too far? I mean, how do you wrap your mind around that debate?
Well, how do I do it? I take things that I think could have some sort of, and nobody's an expert on the future, including me.
Right.
But I can see where things could be extended. So brain implants, you can see lots of really helpful benefits to people who are having issues with communication. And that's going to ramp up. Prosthetics, the same. I'm going to show a video at the Dark Sky Festival of a young woman who was a ballroom dancer who lost the lower part of her left leg in the terrorist bombing at the Boston Marathon 10 years ago. Well, a guy named Hugh Herr at the MIT worked with a team to design a prosthetic lower leg and foot so that she can now ballroom dance again. Now, you have to say, okay, not every amputee is going to have access to a guy like Hugh Herr. But the point is, it can be done. And so you asked about the ethical issues. One of the important ethical social issues is, how do we get this out to the general public? Not just somebody who happens to run into an MIT professor, but actually available. So, it's one thing to predict, it's another thing to make it practical, and it's another thing to make it available, and it's another thing to make sure it's equitable. And so I think these are all really important issues. And, you can sort of fantasize about flying cars and stuff like that. But when you really get down to who's going to have a flying car or make use of it, it's a tiny percentage of the population, and they're probably very rich.
You're talking about, or your book gets into how tech and innovation will shape sort of how we understand ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive our time on Earth, and perhaps our lifespans, where we choose to live. I mean, it's all fascinating stuff. I love getting into the future of cities and the future of communities and what generations after these generations will prioritize or endeavor to have as part of their experience. Where did you focus on?
When it comes to cities, I think one of the important principles about future city design has to incorporate more nature. And whether that involves so-called sponge cities, where instead of water running down acres of pavement and causing floods, it soaks into the ground because you use a different kind of surface material for roads. It's planting more trees. It's just mimicking nature in as many ways as you can. And there are two reasons for this. One, a city that incorporates a lot of nature is a better city to live in. It absorbs heat better. As I said, water drains away and doesn't cause flooding or ice buildup, as we're all too familiar with in Alberta. That's one reason. The other is being exposed. Everybody in Alberta that goes to the mountains knows this. When you're exposed to nature, you feel better, and it's good for you. Lots of studies have shown that your blood pressure drops, your stress levels drop, chemicals in your body that are actually good for you seem to grow in numbers. So I think incorporating nature should be a really important theme. And, by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population are going to be city dwellers. So it's just ultra important.
What would that number look like now, approximately? Like if 2/3 by 2050, where are we at right now, approximately?
I think we're around 50 to 55%, but we're looking at a world population right now of 8 billion. So it'll be 10 billion by 2050. So you're going to have cities. I mean, there are already cities that are roughly 25 million. Well, they're going to be 50 million or some enormous number. And you can just imagine a lot of the old solutions, they're just not going to apply. And so people do have to be thinking a little bit beyond the possible into something that, or things that may seem crazy. But in the end, one of those crazy things might turn out to be fantastic.
We're showing National Geographic's done a lot of really neat work on cities of the future. We're showing some footage right now for people watching on YouTube of Singapore as one of the cities of the future, and obviously representing one of the world's more populated urban centers. Do you or have you looked into it all, Jay? When you take a look at the global population right now at 8 billion, you say it'll be up by 10 billion in the next 15 to 25 years. Is there kind of like I don't know what I want to call this, a drop dead number? Like, is there like maximum capacity? Is there a tipping point when it comes to population with regards to what Earth can sustain, all things considered?
That has to be tied into climate change because there are already places in the world that have been identified as potential places where it's just too hot to live. And if those eventuate and then more of them come on stream, then you're going to have an issue where people are going to be migrating in gigantic numbers around the world. And it's just impossible to say what that's going to happen to population growth. There have been some recent projections that even though population is going to continue to grow to 2050, it may actually level out and then start to drop. And some of the more extreme projections suggest that by 2100, the world population might be less than it is now. And, while some of us might think, more nature, less pollution and so on, it's a question of actually keeping the economies going as well if you actually get a severe drop in population. So this is why you should never make hard predictions, because there are just too many elements at work. And, even though I think neurobrain implants are going to be important, I don't know what's going to happen that might interrupt that progress. But we're going to be talking about that in Jasper. And, the fact that I'm taking pieces from the book, but also pieces that arose after the book was finished. And then you're going to add rock and roll, because I'm giving this talk with a band.
I love
and
it.
Fantastic video. It becomes a different kind of experience. Just had to plug that. Sorry.
Well, no, and yeah, we're going to plug the heck out of this thing, obviously. People can get details. It's coming up October 21st. Again, it's free at 7:30, which is absolutely awesome. That's coming up this Saturday. Jay Ingram and the Dark Sky Band out in Jasper as part of the Dark Sky Festival. That runs through till October 29th. You can get details and plan your getaway to one of the world's largest dark sky reserves at jasperdarksky.travel. Before we go, and I do think it's interesting, I want to circle back on one thing. It's fascinating for me. You're talking about like workforce, essentially economic feasibility by maintaining population levels. You need workers, you need the next generation, you need all these things. Despite the fact that automation becomes more and more of a factor, we understand that jobs are always created when new industries emerge in so many ways that other jobs are maybe phased out or lost. There's also attitude changes too, right? Like, you look at it's less and less common for somebody to be married at 18 or 19, to have their first kid at 20, to have 4 kids by 27. You know what I mean? There's a lot of people that don't see marriage as a priority, that don't see having a family as a priority, which is perfectly fine. Obviously, there's people that have all different takes on property ownership and vehicle ownership and all the things. I'm fascinated by these conversations. We're also talking about the future of food. And I want to ask you about this before we go. I mean, lab-grown meat is just like one example of 1,000 of what we could bring up right now. But how do you think that humans will be procuring our food, growing our food, purchasing our food? What do you think it looks like in the future?
So this is also an environmental issue because while we're very proud in Alberta of our ranching and farming, as we should be, the inescapable fact is that the production of meat, whether you're talking about beef, pork, lamb, chicken, hits the environment much harder than vegetables. And cattle rank at the top in terms of the amount of land they need, the amount of water is necessary to actually produce a steak. And so I think, and you mentioned lab-grown meat, and you also were showing Singapore, where the first lab-grown chicken nuggets are for sale right now.
Yeah.
So, but I think it's because lab-grown meat, the key to this is you only need a few cells from an animal. You could take it, take it with a needle and grow it in the lab. The problem is we're very good at growing cells in the lab, but on a medical scale where you have a few cells in a glass dish, you're going to need giant vats to be able to do this. I think it's possible, but it's going to be some of these transitions, and you mentioned a lot of them, are going to be very difficult. And right now, I think there might only be 5 countries in the world that are actually having babies at a replacement level. You have to have 2.1 children to ensure that the population is sustained. Well, countries like Japan, they haven't been doing that for a long time, and they're facing issues. A very aging population. Aging populations need a lot of medical and health support, even if we get much better at dealing with late life disease. So you see what I'm getting at? Like, it's a multi-branching sort of issue. And I think globally, there's going to have to be a significant shift away from very environmentally intense food production to something that's more sustainable. And people laugh if you say, what about eating insects? And that's actually just a cultural blind spot when you consider that probably 2 billion people in the world eat insects or insect products routinely. They're fine. It's just we have this very strong cultural. There's a great line in thinking about eating grasshoppers. Somebody decided to call them sky prawns. So,
Okay.
But it's still a grasshopper.
Hang on a second, but you remember, and I mean, I'll call the Canadian Taxpayers Federation to the carpet here because, they've never strayed away from a sensational story, but that's fine. They got to do their thing. They got to do their job. They got to make governments look silly and foolish and frivolous with your tax dollars. But they had a lot of traction in September, just last month, for a piece that showed that the federal government had spent, just under $500,000, about $420,000 over the past 5 years. So really nothing compared to other government expenditures, subsidizing companies, as they call it, which is an interesting way to put it. You might put supporting research or stimulating the economy, whatever you want to call it, but subsidizing companies that turn crickets into human food. They said their federal director, Franco Terrazzano, who I know personally, quote, Canadians are struggling as inflation pushes up grocery bills, but subsidizing snacks made out of bugs doesn't sound like the right solution for taxpayers. Now, here's the thing. There's a whole lot of reasons why that actually makes sense and why that research could be valuable. And I happen to have interviewed an entrepreneur a few years ago who's building a really impressive business, and he's doing it in like 300 square feet, by the way, because farming crickets requires a whole lot less space than growing grain, as an example. But he's been selling his cricket flour. And for a lot of people, if you can wrap your mind around, if you don't have those like cultural barriers or those impediments, as you described, Jay, if the ick factor is not relevant or applicable to you, there's a lot of reasons why it does make sense. But it requires us to think outside in so many ways as lab-grown meat does as well, to think outside of what we're used to, of the way we've always done it.
But I don't think we have to think that far outside, because if you're eating cookies made with cricket flour, you have no clue that crickets were part of that.
I would want to know, though, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I want to know. But did you know that already there are a certain number of insect parts are allowed in food that we buy at the supermarket?
Like what?
So, I mean, if people are dead set against consuming even a fragment of the thorax of a grasshopper, They're already doing it. And the thing is, yeah, I'd like to know, but if the cost is dramatically less, then, people like taxpayers, what are they called?
Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Yeah.
Yeah. They should have a look at that side of the argument as well.
Yeah, but that's journalism, Jay. That's like investigating and digging.
I apologize.
And seeking to understand, and that doesn't get clicks unless they're on Real Talk. Yeah. So I also want to circle. You make an important point. I want to circle this, and so we can all focus on it. And you say if cost is a factor, let's also remember that cost isn't always just the money. Right? The cost of the way that we do business, the cost of how humanity functions takes its toll environmentally and otherwise. And obviously, it's something we got to pay close attention to. You've been hearing from Jay Ingram. He is the author of a brand new book. You can find it. It's out now, Jay, isn't it? Like it's just out,
yes.
Right?
Yep.
Awesome. Wherever people find great books, you will find The Future of Us, the science of what we'll eat, where we'll live, and who we'll be, by our guest, Jay Ingram. And you can also catch Jay Ingram and the Dark Sky Band show. So fun. Saturday, the 21st of October. That's this weekend at Commemoration Park in Jasper. It's free. It starts at 7:30, and you can get more details at jasperdarksky.travel. This interview has been presented by our friends at Tourism Jasper. Jay, we always love talking to you. We always learn something. Thanks for this.
Thanks a lot, Ryan.
You got it, buddy. Let me ask you a question.
How did I know you're going to turn right to me and ask about the lab-grown meat?
Exactly. Because I want to ask you something. I know.
I'm down. I'm 100% down.
And can I also say how much I appreciate that you're like, you see this question coming from a mile away, and you've always been willing.
Mm-hmm.
You're a resident plant-based expert, but you've told us that you never swore off steak, or you never swore off like anything like that, ribs, prawns.
Sky prawns?
I won't keep
Sky
rubbing it
prawns?
in. What did he call them? Sky prawns?
Prawns.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But if you think about prawns and lobsters and all the bottom, if you think of like bassa, catfish, all that, like it's disgusting what they eat, but they taste amazing. We shouldn't think about it too much, should we? We're going to get turned off from all our food. But you never left eating meat because you didn't like the taste of meat.
No.
There were ethical reasons, right? So if it's lab-grown meat,
yeah.
could you see yourself you're in?
I'm in 100%.
Okay.
I'm the guy in the summer. I go outside, let my dog out, and there's that neighbor with the steaks on the grill. And
You
I
never fell out of
smell
love with
and
it,
I'm
right?
Like, I wish I could. Even my wife is like, she used to love the keg, right? The baked potato and the veggies and the big steak. But I think for me, my biggest concern for the future, everyone's talking about, global warming, this and that. That's not my biggest concern. Everyone comes up to me, oh, you're so concerned about oil and the environment. No, I'm concerned about water. And if you talk to a lot of experts, that's what they say the next thing is, like, we need to conserve water. We need clean water. I mean, we talk about it with the indigenous populations on the reserves and things like that. We talk about it in third world countries where they don't have clean water. Water is a big one. And to grow live animals the way we do now naturally, it takes a ton of water. A pound of beef is 2,500 gallons of water. A pound of beef to produce. And a pound of wheat, if you look at the comparison, is 25 gallons of water. So, I mean, we've got to figure out a way. And to me, I mean, a lot of people are like, I would never eat lab-grown meat. Well, if you lost a leg and they could regrow your leg and attach it, would you do it? Of course you would. If you lost a limb, if they could regrow it. If you lost your eyes and they could regrow them and put them in.
Eating pot roast and growing amputated legs in the same sentence, but you're 100% right.
I'm just saying.
You're 100% right.
If it was life-threatening, you'd do it, but if you're going to put it in your body, you wouldn't.
Man, we're going to be growing valves for people's hearts.
Oh, my gosh.
We're going to be growing things like
they say we're going to be growing
eyeballs,
hearts
retinas,
eventually.
growing hearts. Why not? Grow organs.
Yeah.
I mean, we look at organ donor lists. This is a reminder, by the way, next time you renew your driver's license to make sure you
check that box.
You check that box and become an organ donor. All of these points that you're making are such good points. I will say this. I don't need and again, I come from a farming family.
Yeah.
I never have any dirt under my fingernails, but my cousins do.
I like that you always say that.
Well, I don't want people coming up to me and being like, like, what do you think of the new John Deere
You're not out
XL
there tilling
445? And I'm like, I don't know, dude. I have no idea. But let me just say this in plain language. I don't need an animal to die to enjoy a pot roast, but I'd love to continue enjoying pot roast. And I recognize that a lot of people are moving, maybe not even entirely away from meat, but some people are just changing their diets. I know that families, based on cost, based on ethics, based on a whole bunch of things, are starting to like cut back on the amount of meat that they consume in a week, which is also good for you. Yeah. There are benefits to eating meat, and there's a lot of benefits to cutting back on it, and that's great. I think I could get past if like I don't need to see the animal slaughtered and butchered to enjoy a T-bone. If you could put a lab-grown T-bone in front of me, it doesn't even have to be bone in. It could be a ribeye. This is how open-minded I am. I don't need the bone. If it tastes good, if the texture is the same, then I don't care. I think it's actually great.
Yeah, and so for me, I mean, water is the big one. Land also, like it takes a lot of space to raise animals, and then obviously the methane and the stuff from cows, and so there's a lot of factors. And people are always like, well, they bring up these crazy, arguments with me. Soy. It takes so much land to grow soy, and it kills the animals as well. Well, 80% of soy is fed to animals. Humans only eat 20% of it. So if you want to cut that down drastically, we could do that as well. But the thing is, I'm the same way. I love your family. I have nothing against farmers. They're doing what they've been raised to do for hundreds of years.
Thank you, farmer.
It's in their blood. I get it. But if we could figure out a way to live better, have more water, have more space, because as we were just talking about, population increase, and still have the things we love like meat, and still have the animals, but not have to. I mean, the big thing for me is that they're commodities, right? They're not really animals. They're being grown to the earliest stage they can, and then they die, right? If we could still have them around, enjoy them, but still be able to eat them, like he said, by just taking a few cells, why wouldn't we want this? And the one thing I'll say at the end, as long as it's safe. Obviously, we have to research, like, is lab-grown meat going to affect us the same way as real meat?
Sure. Nothing that you're saying is outrageous, Johnny. I love this. We got a rancher in the chat that says we truck water to our cattle all summer, all fall, over 4,000 gallons of water a day.
Jesus.
To give you a sense, 4,000 gallons, that's approximately 16,000 liters. That's approximately 16 hot tubs. That's how I wrap my mind around stuff. Galaxy Hunter says water. Okay, sure, but let's definitely make sure we have more open pit mining in the Canadian Rockies. Thank you, Galaxy Hunter, for that. Scott says if it fills me up and it doesn't hurt, I'll hook into the sky prawns. No worries. Akat with an interesting question for you, Johnny. Is this a moral conundrum or not? Say cricket protein that's not vegan, is it?
No, it's not. And I've talked about that too, where like. I'm glad Jay brought that up. There is all sorts of things, and I don't want to get disgusting here, that as he was saying that, I was researching, and I know about this. I know there's a certain amount of worm byproduct that can be in certain meats legally. I know that there's I got told this the other week. Do you know there's a certain percentage of rat and mice hair in every jar of peanut butter?
Man.
It's under 1%, but it's in
under
there.
1%. Better be way below 1%.
Because the factories are huge, right? And a lot of them are older, especially, in the States where...
Okay.
Anyways.
All right.
And, with bugs, there's bugs in everything. I opened a thing of spinach the other day, and a grasshopper jumped out. My wife was like, throw it out. I'm like, do you know how much plants...
What do you mean it jumped out? It was still alive?
It was still alive in there.
Jeez.
But anyways, we're eating it all the time.
I was scrolling through Netflix last night looking for an option, and there's this documentary on there called Poisoned. It's basically like what you don't know about your food supply. And I'm going to be honest with you, the thumbnail, as we might call it, the ad for the documentary had a plate of oysters on it. I love oysters. I was like, I'm not watching that. I don't want to know. Some things I just don't want to know.
Keep the curtain closed.
Leslie says, newsflash, everybody, you don't actually have to kill anything to get plenty of your daily protein needs. Plants have protein as well. The meat and dairy industry doesn't want you to know that. We could get nutritionists on. I would love to have these conversations. I'm going to let you know I was at a...
Well, we had a great
kind of a
vegan on one.
What
was her name? Jen. She was great. And
We've had several, and we should do another one. That would be great. I also had an opportunity to check in. It was kind of this entrepreneurs event that I attended, and I had a verbal agreement from this entrepreneur, and I won't say her name until we confirm her on the show, but she's working in a leadership role with a company that is innovating on things like and including including lab-grown meat. And so I'm going to make a commitment to you, Real Talkers, that we're going to book her on the show, let's say within the next 2 weeks, if her schedule allows, and we'll certainly keep you posted on that. Love all the feedback that was in the chat today, and people kind of sharing where they land on things like cricket proteins and all kinds of stuff.
And I understand with all this, it's a trade-off. Like, I do know, I've looked into it because obviously I'm interested that, growing meat in a lab there's a significantly higher cost. So it's a trade-off. Like, do we want more water and more land and pay a little bit more money to do it like this? Will the meat be unattainable? Meat is already, we're talking about it every day. I go in the grocery store, I still walk by the meat aisle. I'm like, how are people paying for this? 6 chicken breasts is like double, triple what it used to be.
Well, didn't you hear Pierre Poilievre? Turkeys are $130 now.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? We've got to talk about all that. So it'd be great if you got someone on to. Yeah. We'll
do it. And this is kind of how this show comes together, right? Some of the stuff is obvious. Tomorrow we're going to be talking to an expert on, and a board member of Canadians for Peace and Justice in the Middle East. Some of the stuff is obvious. It's slapping us in the face. It's kicking us in the teeth and punching our gut. The stuff that happens in the world around us, where we want coverage and insight. But then there's the other stuff. A lot of times the stories of innovation, of positivity, or maybe sometimes the ethical quandaries or whatever, they get pushed to the side in the news cycle. And we want this show to be somewhere where there's real talk on real issues that matter to real people like me and Johnny and you. And we're grateful for your feedback. Obviously, our live tuning audience, which brings it every single morning on YouTube, on those that are tuned in on the Mixlr audio app, the live streaming audio app presented by California Closets. And then, of course, those of you that listen to and subscribe to the podcast, we sure appreciate you as well. The show, frankly, doesn't happen without the support of Real Talk sponsors like our friends at Eden Landscaping. Whatever your vision is, they will execute it with precise attention to detail. They complete full-service landscaping from excavation through to the finished project. The majority of your landscaping handled by their team, but they've also got strong relationship with skilled trades, which means that any construction need, they can handle it. I mean, all this talk about food, more and more people are building these edible garden boxes, integrating those into their family's plan. There's nothing tastier than a salad comprised of everything that you grew in your own garden, right? We've even had people in our neighborhood converting their front yards, getting rid of the grass, and the front yards are basically urban farming. It's so very cool. Whether you want to remove existing greenery, maybe you want to level ground, you need excavation done, you need stonework done, hardscaping, retaining walls. Eden Landscaping for more than 20 years has been doing exactly that. You can get in touch with them today. Start that conversation at landscapeedmonton.ca. If your construction needs are a little bit bigger, maybe it's a renovation of your basement, maybe you own a small office building and you're thinking of converting it to living spaces as people's needs evolved in city centers across Alberta, make your first call, Complete Care Restoration. You'll find them online at completecarerestoration.ca, or you can give them a call, 780-454-0776. This company was founded on the principle of providing above-the-norm levels of customer service and attention to their clients. That means that every project, regardless of size and scope, they aim for that to be a fulfilling experience for themselves and their customers. Work, they think, is an opportunity to meet new friends, to enrich each other's lives, and being a helping hand, sometimes in times of adversity, is their top priority at Complete Care Restoration. Did you see this story? Wanted to update something quick. Nice new music bed, by the way. I like that. Wanted to update a story. We were talking about this out of Red Deer. You remember this? The school trustee?
Oh, yeah.
And I just wanted to update and give credit to Lana Michelin, who's a veteran journalist out of Central Alberta, been doing a good job for a really long time. Monica LaGrange was that Red Deer school trustee. That
she's a prophet, right?
Well, that's what she's claiming now. I shouldn't put those words in her mouth, but basically, she's the one that had the social media post that said brainwashing is brainwashing. Mm-hmm. And it showed kids, Nazi youth, waving the swastika flags in the 1930s, 1940s, and then kids with pride flags at present-day schools. And so obviously the board has censured this trustee who has refused to apologize, and they have just publicly released basically a 15-page document. It was made public by the local Catholic school board out of Central Alberta, out of Red Deer, just yesterday, at the request of LaGrange's lawyer. So the trustee's lawyer is the one that asked that this be released. And the documents show of the discussion that took place at the end of September as the school board deliberated with her and her lawyer over what they should do in response to public criticism of her actions. Should she be asked to resign? They can't really. I mean, obviously, in a weird and kind of heartbreaking way, she saw a lot of support for this, while other people were appalled. But the point is, and the headline here is that this Catholic school trustee, Monica LaGrange, told the board that the Holy Spirit told her to, quote, go for it.
Hallelujah.
The Holy Spirit told her to go for it.
Get the kids.
And to post the meme of the Nazi youth and pride and to compare the two. And so she's doing it, she says, on the instruction of and with the encouragement of the Holy Spirit. She believes that the United Nations and Planned Parenthood is attempting to sabotage our youth's identities. It's hijacked the LGBTQ's original mandate. She believes that the beliefs of students, including sexuality, should be between God, parents, and children, and that sexual orientation decisions should not be made or influenced at school, especially Catholic schools. Said the Holy Spirit told her to post the meme. And so there's the update on that story.
Well, what about all the heterosexual books and stuff like that? If we're not going to, indoctrinate
No, that's not a
sexual
choice, Johnny.
orientation.
That's not a choice. That's not a lifestyle. Just being gay. Just being gay. Yeah.
Just being gay.
Yeah. Science.
Just being.
Science.
I don't even want to say it.
Go for it.
I won't go for it. The Holy Spirit told me to only drink Bud Light for the rest of my.
The Holy Spirit
tenure
told
here.
you to leave this one alone.
The other day I had a take on the show. I said, I don't want to give my opinion on this. It was something to do with, all that crazy stuff going over in Israel. And I said, I don't want to give an opinion on this. And then somebody in the chat was like, not giving an opinion is a bad take. I was like, there's no winning.
There's no winning. At least you figured that out. We laugh so we don't cry. When it comes to that, coming up on tomorrow's show, we will have that conversation, and we invite you to join us as we'll check in with. She's a board member. She's with the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. Gada Sasa will be our guest, and we're going to be talking about developments in Israel, in Gaza, and obviously that horrific bombing of that hospital that occurred just a very short time ago. You can let us know your thoughts anytime. We're available. Our inbox talk at ryanjespersen.com. You can find us on social media as well. We want to thank you for being a part of this episode of Real Talk. Before you go, make sure you subscribe on YouTube. If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast and tell your friends. It means a lot to independent entities like us when you share our content, when you follow us on social media, and most importantly, when you tell your friends. That's how we grow the audience. It's how we grow the reach, and it's how we grow the impact of the conversations that we're having. If you want to do more, you can check out our website. That's ryanjespersen.com. Under the Connect link, you'll find an option to support us on Patreon by becoming a Real Talk patron. You tap into a whole bunch of other cool things, including behind-the-scenes access and a very special gift that you can't buy in our merch store. We'll see you soon.
Real Talk is hosted by Ryan Jespersen, executive producer Josh Dunford, technical producer